Good afternoon or good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's live. So thanks for joining us over on Facebook and YouTube. Give us a shout out where you are. So today, once again, we're just going to be editing a photo. And as you can see in the comments, you're more than welcome to download it either now or later on and give a try of some of the techniques that we're going to look at. And once again, it will just be a short 10 to 15 minute edit rather, and then you can carry on about your day. So let's bring up the shot that we're going to look at. So this is one I took last year, I think in the summer in Canada. So if we just open up the original, let's just grab this one. So you can see it's kind of a little bit hazy and not much detail going on just because of all the spray. So it could be one of those shots that you might just bypass because you think it's a little bit too difficult to edit, but there's plenty of data as we can see in there, and I ended up making a black and white out of it after all. So that's what we're going to do today, or at least that is the goal. Any questions, feel free to pop them into the comments either on Facebook or over on YouTube as well, and then I'll do my best to answer some of those questions too. Okay, so let's just hide my face for a second and see what we're looking at. So before anything else, if we look at the levels tool, let's just bring that out for a second. Even before making any edits onto any edits on the photo itself, we can see that it's relatively flat just by looking at the histogram. We've got no sort of data over this end of the histogram, and then we've got no data over this end, which is really what's causing it to be super flat. So a simple thing we can do is just to hit auto on the levels, and that's already going to kind of go a long way to help improving it as well. Now looking at that sort of straight away, we can see maybe it's a bit too contrasty. Maybe the midtones aren't quite right, but we can fix that. So I'm actually just going to reset that. And before we do anything else, I might just bring up the exposure just a tiny bit so the histogram's sitting in the middle a little bit more. And then once again, if we say auto, then it's going to snap those back in. Now there's nothing to stop you just bringing those out a little bit if you want to. I just want to make sure I don't lose any shadow detail over there on the left hand side. Let's pop that back out the way for a second and see what else we can do. Okay. I'm thinking really in the center of the shot, this is kind of where we want to get the most detail out of it. And if you look in my edited one, if we just move on to the next shot, you can actually see there was quite a lot going on in the clouds and so on and so forth. So it's all there. It's just a case of extracting it. So next step I think I would do is just see what we can do with adding a bit of contrast, and also now playing with the high dynamic range sliders as well. So obviously those clouds are in the upper end of the scale. So if we just play around with highlights, we can see what we can bring back. And that's already getting in quite a lot of detail of the cloud as well. What I'm going to do later on is sort of fix that, again, flatness within the clouds with a local adjustment. But let's see how far we can get without doing any sort of local edits at all. So let's go to around there. And remember the highlights, as we've learned in our other live editing sessions, the highlight sort of deals to the upper end of the histogram, whereas our white slider, that's kind of really the top end. So highlights, top third of the histogram, if you like, or a bit less. Whites right at the end of the histogram. Let's pop this one back again out the way and see what we can do. So the highlights getting quite a lot of detail back in the clouds. If we play with the whites, you're going to see it's not so much of a dramatic effect because we don't have any really bright highlights there. So the white's not going to give us much change there. But already if we reset what we've done so far, so alt click on a reset button, you can see before and after. Now a really good method for reducing haze as well is to add clarity. Now the clarity, this is, if you like, our mid-tone contrast. So it's going to help our contrast and reduce some of that haze, but it's not going to affect our shadows and highlights. So we can be pretty aggressive with the clarity. So if we go up this much, you can really see the difference in between having a whole bunch of clarity and not so much. So for the image in general, I'm going to stop there. And then what we're going to do is put more clarity into where those clouds are, because the clouds could probably take this much or even more, but it's maybe a little bit too much for the rest of the shot. So let's go sort of around the midway point. I'm a bit conscious it's getting a bit dark here, so I'm just going to lift up the blacks a tiny bit as well, maybe a little bit of shadows. Okay. So now that's quite a long way, and just to remind ourselves, that's how we started, and this is where we are now, just with a few tweaks of some basic sliders. So any of you can manage that, no problem. But I think in this area where it's mistiest, we can actually do a bit better by adding some more clarity, contrast, or whatever. And we want to play around with a few sliders to see exactly what we can do. So what I'm going to do is add a new filled layer over here in layers. So that's going to add a complete adjustment or mask over the whole shot. So now what we can do is experiment with a few other sliders. So I'm looking kind of, let's actually just draw a little annotation. Let's grab a pen. What should we go for? Something that we can see. So I'm looking in kind of this area, pretty much. So if we can improve that a little bit more, because that's the haziest bit. So we kind of want to restrict our adjustment to this point, but I don't know what adjustments I want to use yet. So that's why I've started with this filled layer. So I'm just going to call that clouds. And once again, that's the whole layer. So what could we do? We could add actually some more contrast and clarity. Remember, there's already a little bit on the background, but the clouds can take a bit more. So they can probably handle that much. So actually all the way up to 100, no problems. We could maybe add, maybe not contrast, because then we're starting to lose the whites of our clouds there. But maybe we could take the brightness down just to darken them a bit, like so. So that's, I think, a good adjustment set for the clouds. But remember, that was a mask. That was over the whole shot. So we want to restrict that. So I'm going to right click on my clouds layer and just say clear mask. Now that's going to clear the mask, but my underlying adjustments I made of brightness and clarity are still there. So now I can go with my brush and paint them back in. Now normally I do this with quite a low flow, which just restricts how much masking is applied with each brush stroke. So it's a percentage amount. So with flow on 7, every brush stroke is going to be 7%. So 7, 14, 21, doing maths in my head, always a bad idea, 28 and so on. So this allows us to build it up slowly. So now I can start brushing, making sure we're good. Yep. And then that will gradually bring in the adjustment into this area. Now I've got the mask turned off, so you can't see the red coming in, because then we can gradually see it change. Now let's turn this layer off and on. So it's quite slight at the moment. So if we press M, it's actually too little. So I'm going to turn the flow up, so it's just a little bit more responsive. There we go. So that was too low a flow really for that adjustment. Now this might be a bit too much, but so far so good, like so. So that's just bringing back a bit of detail into those areas. So if you want to see the mask now, if I press M, you can see the mask like so. So now that looks much, much better. If we turn the clouds on and off, that's just liberated it a bit more. Now we can, now I think probably the flow is a bit too much there. So if I turn that down, I'm just going to sort of feather off the edges around the outside. And what we could also do is turn the opacity down a little bit like so. So you can see the effect that it's having. So we don't want it to be too unrealistic. So I'm going to stop around something like that. So once again, let's see how we started. That was how it came out of camera, super flat. And then with a couple of different adjustments we did as well. Now I'm just going to change the crop slightly. Let's just go a bit more panoramic, like so. And before we go to black and white, I'm just going to have a look at the questions. Let's have a look. Do the new black and white sliders, Travis was asking, under HDR, do they do the same as the level sliders? That's a great question. No, they don't actually. Let's just bring that out as well. They're actually going to have a much more dramatic effect. So let's just pull those out for a second. And it is quite a different adjustment. So once again, if we pull this one in and this one in, looking at it in conjunction with the histogram at the top, you can see exactly what's happening. So if you imagine you're holding either end of your histogram and you're pulling it out, that's what's happening when you're bringing these sliders in, and you're getting a much more even histogram spread over the shot like so. So that's really the job of the levels, and that's why you have two numbers down here, 30 and 215. So we're saying capture one, take this number and map it to the number at the top. So like holding either end and stretching out that histogram like so. So that gives us the correct tonal range. Now what whites and blacks do is slightly different things. So that's controlling the brightness or luminosity of the histogram at either end. So if I grab my blacks, for example, you can see it just wiggling a little bit at the end of the histogram. So you see if I bring the blacks down, you can see how targeted it is right at the end of the tonal range, like so. So very specific. If we move this, you can see how it's affecting the whole histogram to some extent as well. So it's doing quite a different job, or the image will behave differently when you adjust this. So if we look at the black again, barely anything is moving here, and it's just wiggling at the end of the histogram, you can see like so. So where was I? I was about there, I think, wasn't I? So that's a really good question, because you could think, well, I'm just going to use these, but it's not the same. Again, you'll see if we move the white slider, how much the histogram is changing. If we grab this one, like so, it's targeted just to the top end again, like so. So it's a different adjustment. So use the levels to get your correct tonal range, and then use highlight, shadows, whites and blacks to sort of fine tune what you're doing. Okay, that was a really good question. Thanks for that, Travis. What's the difference between opacity on the brush? So another good question. Well done. So flow is the rate at which the mask lays down. So think of that as a really wet paintbrush or a dry paintbrush. So with a low flow, it takes a long time to build up the mask so you can control what's happening. Opacity is where you want it to stop. So at 100% or 50 or whatever. Now I leave this at 100 pretty much all the time now, because we can always go back to our layer and play with the opacity retrospectively, like so. So I don't really find much of a need for this anymore, because we have control in the layers. But if you know what it's doing, it does help. So let's put those guys back away. And one last question, and then we will convert to black and white. Would sharpening be of use here? That was Bill asking. At the moment, we might look at that at the end. Because of all the mist and the haze, it's not super sharp, but so adding more sharpening, don't know if that's going to help necessarily, but we could try. We'll try that at the end just to see. Maybe we could just sharpen the middle part, but it might take a little bit. Okay, so am I happy with what we've done? I think so. Maybe I'm just going to try something. Going to make a new layer, grab our gradient brush and pull that down. Now right now that's going to be a linear gradient. So if we press M, it's going to fall off nicely. Let's just hold shift to straighten it. But if we want to make the fall off a bit harder, we can hold our Alt key down, or Option, and then we can change how the fall off works. Now I don't quite know if I'm going to need this, but I figured, can we get even more out the sky? Yeah, we could actually. Not too much. And brightness down a little bit. So that's just always name your layers. Clouds upper. If we turn that on and off, it just gives a little bit more just to the upper end, like so. But I think that's good. Because it was misty, we don't want to remove all the mist. then it doesn't look like the Niagara Falls. So last but not least, can we improve on sharpening, as that was Bill was asking, I think. Possibly a little bit, but I don't think by much. So if we go to our background layer, Capture One will put the amount of sharpening in based on your camera. So each camera has its own default sharpening level, so it could vary based on each camera, but we could possibly bump that up just a little bit. Where's the Maid of the Mist? Over here. And maybe for edge definition, we could add a bit of structure. But I'm going to be careful because it's fairly grainy and we don't want to make the grain stand out too much, but it does actually help a little bit. Cool. Okay, now the final step, let's say we wanted to make a black and white. I bet it's not going to look anything like this one. I actually think I've done a better job because the cloud looks a bit too bright there. So let's make a new variant or clone a variant. That will do a virtual copy. Keep all my adjustments and so on. So let's say clone variant. So this gives me, whoops, too much, a virtual copy, which I can now do something else with. And the something else for this one is going to be convert to black and white. Where's my black and white tool? There it is, like so. So that gives us our black and white conversion. And then each of these sliders control the density of the color in the shot based on the different channels here. So it's not a lot of red going on. If we take blue, you see that's just changing the density of the blue tones, which is mostly in the sky. There's probably a little bit of green just on the side there, and probably also some yellow, but not a great deal. It's a relatively sort of monochromatic shot, really. So I'm going to go for that, and then fine tune our contrast just with a curve a little bit like so. Now, if we wanted to, we could add a bit of film grain actually. I'm not sure if I want to, but let's just try some cubic grain. And the impact is really how much grain there is, and the granularity is how grainy it is, funnily enough. So impact is like an opacity almost, and granularity is how big each granule is. And then these are different kinds of grain shapes, if you like, but I'm going to go for cubic grain, like so. So there we go. Let's make one last variant. So we're just going to make a new variant, which will be how it came out of camera. So that's how we started. Then we made that, and then we did this black and white, like so. So 3 different views. Let's get rid of film grain, hide the browser, and that's pretty much it, really. Let's just bring up the original and the color one next to it, because that's a good comparison, like so. Let's hide our tools as well. Let's zoom in ever so slightly on both of them. See, there's all kinds of nice cloud shapes going on there and everything. All the data's there in the file. It's just a case of playing with it to get what you want out of it. And we didn't do anything super complicated. It's only 2 additional layers. This one you could argue we don't need, but it just gives an extra little something. But really nothing too tricky to make quite a big difference to that shot. Okay, let's have a look at a couple of other questions. Let's see. Great tutorial, thanks. Who was that? That was Belize. Quick question, when shooting real black and white film, when scanning into Capture One, I must select 48-bit RGB rather than 16-bit grey, which works with Photoshop and Lightroom. It's purely because if you are scanning and you want to see black and white, Capture One is always working in a color sort of space environment, for example. So it has to be in color, not grey space. Otherwise, it doesn't work in Capture One. So it's got to be RGB. It can't be grayscale. Capture One does not work in grayscale. Always has to work in RGB. Let's see. Is there a way to reset an image without losing the crop? Reset everything but the crop, in other words. No, there isn't. You could reset the individual tools, but that would be a little bit time consuming. So the answer is no, but that's not actually a bad idea though, Todd. So that's maybe something we can think about in the future. Let's bring the image back up because I think there's probably a question coming up for that shortly. That's the right one, isn't it? Let's hide the browser. Let's just have a look. Can you create more than 14 layers? Roland was asking. You can create, what is the maximum now? I've forgotten. Mental block. I think it's 16 is the maximum. Let's just add some. Ooh, there we go. So 16 layers we can do. Now I've never really got close to that, so I think that's generally enough layers that we can cope with to have in the shot itself. Let's see, and last couple of questions before we have to go. Yuri was asking flow or pen pressure. Not quite sure what you mean there, Yuri. Well, okay, I think I do. So in here you can say use pen pressure, but that only adjusts the brush size with pen pressure. Now, depending how deft you are with the pen, I'm not so deft with it. I tend to turn that off because I find I can adjust the brush size pretty quickly just with the right click, or if you prefer keyboard shortcuts, you can use the square brackets. But if you can get your head round flow and brush size on pen pressure at the same time, and you can moderate your pen pressure, you could probably speed up your masking a little bit as well. So give that a try yourself. Okay, one last question, and then we'll just give you a few messages and that would be it. Oh, Travis was asking, under the color editor, under the basic tool, actually we can try a new feature. We can add that to the broadcast. Oh, that's fancy. You used to be able to select a color and the preview would then only show the blue colors. Its properties could then be adjusted. Okay, is the option gone? No, it's not actually. So let's take that off the broadcast. What you're looking for, Travis, is, because we redesigned the color editor, so the idea is now with the color editor, you can use the picker and then you can click drag to adjust on the image itself or directly. If we click here, then you can adjust the color tones and you can see the selected color range as well. But the idea of the basic color editor is to reduce the amount of steps you have to take to do quick and simple color editing. So these zones are set quite specifically, and lots of research went into it to make sure that when you pick the reds, blues, it kind of behaved in the way you would expect. Now, if you want to, if you click on the three dots, you can edit the tones to your own liking. You can also reset to default, and you can see the selected color range as well if you want. But it sounds, Travis, that you know what you're doing in terms of color editing, so you might just prefer the advanced color editor, because then you can click on the color you want to edit and then click on view selected color range, and then everything else goes to black and white. So you might find working in the advanced color editor is giving you what you need as well. Okay, when you are creating a variant, can you carry the ratings over? That is a good question. So if we make this 5 stars and we say clone variant, it automatically comes over. So if you're cloning, then it will bring the metadata as well. If you're making a new variant, then it's kind of a clean slate, if you like. All right, so thanks for joining us today for another quick edit. Don't forget, if you want to download the raw file, you can. It's in the comments on Facebook and YouTube. So just download and have a look. You'll find it's an EIP file, which means that it's got 2 variants. So it had the raw file and the original edit I did yesterday, which actually I don't like it as much as the one that we did today. So you'll find a different variant in there, for example, but just so you can see what I've done. So you can download that and have a go for in your own time. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and so on. We'll be back on Wednesday, and we're going to do a live edit again, but this time we're going to focus on skin tone. So we're actually going to do a quick edit of a headshot, talk about how to use the skin tone part of the advanced color editor, specifically the uniformity section down here, which helps to even up misaligned skin tone. So that's the idea. All right. So thank you everybody once again for coming back. Hope to see you on Wednesday. And on Friday, we've got a couple of guests, Brandy and Emily. So Brandy Nicole and Emily Teague. Emily, we featured as part of our Capture on 20 campaign. They've both just been featured for an Ellencrom campaign, and they're going to show us what they've been up to, stuck indoors in New York for the past few weeks, and do some edits in Capture One as well. So take care, everybody, and see you all again soon. Bye-bye now.